Thank you for turning up so numerous at our lecture. I have the pleasure to introduce Waltraud and Deborah Mabbett. It's one of the best, how can I say, teams in political economy in Europe. They have a common thread of inquiry about social policy. So if I understand well, Deborah works on social policy and courts, for instance, very interesting topics. My favorite article of Deborah was written with Dermot Hodgson about the economic paradigm of the UK. So I invite you to read this one. It's a very interesting piece. Waltraud is one of the leading scholars in European political economy, in the political economy of the Economic and Monetary Union. So I guess today we'll have a very interesting lecture about the European Union acting or not as a hegemon in the bailouts in Hungary and Greece. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dick. It's been a very friendly and continuous reader of things I've done. I think hardly anybody spent so much attention on me. But I'm also happy that I can do today, introduce to you this joint work that I did with Deborah Mabbett. We write quite a lot on it, and she really did as much as I did on this paper that we have completely rewritten for you. Thank you for coming, and I hope there is some interest in this for you. At least it has some Hungarian element in all this, which is a first for me at least. You have a standing offer to interrupt if I'm not clear, if I'm using an expression that you don't know. So just raise your hand. I will be happy to interrupt. I'll present, and then later all the difficult questions go to Deborah. Okay? The start of our paper was really to say, why is it that Hungary got very early on a loan program, a rescue program from the IMF and the EU that went swiftly and quietly. Many people don't even know that they did. While with a member of the monetary union, where in a way you could say all the major players, France, Germany, and so on and so forth, should have more interest to get this quietly and swiftly done, there was a huge problem for everybody to help them. Why is this? And you may know that Hungary was an equally delinquent country that had to be, it was under surveillance for its excessive deficit ever since it entered EMU. It was actually given quite was told off by the council several times, and yet it was helped in a very effective technocratic fashion. But not so Greece, which is arguably a very delinquent member, having come into the monetary union when it, as we know now, was basically already bankrupt. And we are now dealing with the aftermath of that. But so why this difference as a kind of pure empirical puzzle? The theoretical lens that we take is, can hegemonic stability theory, something that Charles Kindleberger kind of established after the breakdown of Bretton Woods, when so the hegemony of the US was in decline, at least for the international monetary system, and so asked, what does it take for the hegemon to provide stability and this be used? Because you could say, what would it take, say, for the Germans? And in our original version, we had much more about the Franco-German couple and how you cannot provide stability. What would it take for the Germans to provide stability to the monetary union? So this was the reason why we came to it. Then through our reading, especially Deborah dug up this Erika Gould, there was quite interesting work done on conditionality and how conditionality had evolved over the years. So we went towards that, and this has now got more prominence and find it extremely useful. So how can we engage these two concepts, hegemonic stability and conditionality, for understanding this empirical puzzle? The evidence that we provide is that we compare these two programs. In what way are they different? They have the interesting feature that the Hungarian program was one where the IMF was the senior partner, so had the lead, provide most of the resources, while it was the other way around in the Greek program. So you can say, is there a difference between programs that the IMF leads and those that the Greeks, the EU leads. That has then to do a little bit with a post-hegemonic program, because we think the IMF today is actually post-hegemony, while the EU struggles with this and has at the moment still a way of trying to provide hegemonic stability, but without the resources that it would require, something we see with here. And what has happened and why we had to rewrite the paper for you is that, of course, both programs in a way failed, but in very different ways. The Hungarians are now back since November last year. They sought again a program while they had called off the first one with impunity, while, you know, then Greece had to come back because they just couldn't fulfill these very harsh conditions that were imposed on them and had to get prolongation, a new credit, and default on more than half of its debt. The conclusion we then have is about, you know, why is Greece different, and it has to be different from Hungary, and the same, why is what the EU can learn from the IMF almost just a negative lesson, in the sense we can't do what the IMF does post-hegemony. At the same time, itself has to adapt to a post-hegemonic reality, and that is what we look at. What would that mean? So, one slide for each part. The empirical case. Hungary was in trouble as early as October 2008, and I can show you that later if the discussion goes to that, because it's very hard to see, especially for those of you in the back of the room. Hungary had much better macroeconomic data if you look at budget deficits, current account deficits, debt. The exception is growth. It was stagnating while Greece was actually growing quite nicely. But Hungary is in trouble much earlier. Greece gets in trouble in December 2009 for reasons we can discuss, and then had a program in October, while Hungary got, within a month of getting in trouble and seeking assistance, it got a program in November 2008. While it took at least almost 6 months until Greece was helped out. It was clearly a current account crisis. This is why the IMF came in. This is what the IMF has been created for. It was a sovereign debt crisis in Greece. This is where the IMF officially can actually not come in. The IMF was never built for that. It's prohibited under the statute that the IMF helps a country in a sovereign debt crisis. So they had to construct some way of coming in, and it had to do with, you know, the withdrawal of banks will create capital account pressures and da-di-da, in order to help the EU out, very clearly. Seniority of the IMF, seniority of the EU in the two programs different. That is interesting for us, a difference we can exploit empirically. And the failure of the two is the thing that the Fidesz, I would say, provokes an end in 610 that had to do with how it treated the central bank here. One of the conditions was that the central bank law had to be amended so that they were truly independent. What the Fidesz government did was almost the opposite, namely made them more dependent, and then the IMF calls this off. In November 2011, the Fidesz government has to come back and say we need assistance, because partly what it also does with the mortgage credit and the imposition of extra levies on the banks withdraw massively from Hungary, and there's a credit crunch in the country, and so it is now in trouble and needs new assistance. Greece needs a second program because it is true the adjustment that was imposed on the country is unprecedented. I mean, how much they have to reduce their primary deficit has not been, any country historically has been asked to reduce so much. And that they could not fulfill that is not surprising. And it has, because the GDP goes down so much, its debt GDP ratio worsens to the extent that it is projected to hit this year almost 200% of GDP debt. And it has as much to do with that it can't get its budget deficit down, so it still adds to the debt stock, but also because the denominator falls by 7 and more 4% now, and so the ratio goes up through that effect as well. And so it's basically private lenders to Greece have been forced to cut off the debt, and a lot of the new program goes then into servicing these reduced bonds. So Greece itself gets very little for investment or anything, and this is the problem that Greece has with the programs. Now, how do we want to look at this difference in programs? That in a way both failed, but very differently. I mean, the failure of Hungary is a nice failure. It's basically a lucky kind of failure, while Greece is the worst case scenario, seen from the point of the IMF or the EU. When you look at this literature of hegemonic stability, we can see very much from hindsight, it was not at the time something that everybody was aware, but from Erika Gold's or Randall Stone's research, you can find that we can distinguish two types of preferences. There is a hegemonic or political preference conditionality, where basically the paymaster, the hegemon, imposes its political preferences on the country, but therefore uses conditionality also very much at its discretion, and is usually not interested when it wants to get its thing done to waive certain conditions if that makes the country comply with its preferences. So the EUS was, at the time when it was, so to speak, the unchallenged hegemon, was not terribly harsh on conditionality, didn't insist on the conditions to be fulfilled to the letter. On the contrary, it wanted a room for maneuver. It was sometimes with its close allies rather generous, to the dismay of the technocrats in Washington. They also don't prescribe deep structural transformation. They are bargaining chips for the country to do what you wanted, and this may go way beyond economic good governance. It may be just political alliances and so on in the Cold War fight. We then get one. You know that the IMF, and I come to this, went through a phase that was with the end of the Cold War division, had this Washington consensus of which Hungary got a dose, like, you should liberalize, privatize, and stabilize, get the Holy Trinity, very much in the line of what a neoclassical economist would say is good economics. It got off that, funnily enough, under its German president at the time, but that had probably less to do with it. Then they just did notice that this kind of deep conditionality, changing whole countries with what they call structural or policy conditionality, didn't work. And what we have today is a financial market conditionality, which was, of course, already the idea there. So ever after the breakdown of Bretton Woods in the early 70s, the IMF is there to basically screen for the financial markets. Is a country able to have access to the markets again? Is it stabilizing to the extent that it at least can service its debt again? And this is the goal. And this is what financial markets interested in. They don't care, so to speak, about good governance in a country as long as that governance makes credit extension and repayment possible. And this is what the IMF did ever since. And it now formulates rules, but has come to go away from deep structural conditionality, but one that is meant to ensure repayment and restore market access, and uses, for example, simple cash-based indicators for the fiscal goals. So says the nominal budget revenues should be that many billions or millions, depending on the size of the economy, and that many expenditure, and controls that, because this determines the cash flow of the government and how much out of that it can pay back and how much deficit it has. While the EU is, or a deep Washington consensus type, define that according to outcomes you want to ensure that says it's on a sustainable path and so on, and the EU has come to say this is when you have to be below 60% debt GDP ratio, but also a deficit ratio that is 3%. So relative to an income, that the national income, and therefore much more an outcome you want to achieve rather than a kind of instrumental goal that shows how able you are to repayment. So, the evidence. This is a big part of the paper, and I'll just give you the gist, and you feel free to come back to it in this discussion, but it's a bit tedious to go through all these details. What we have in Hungary, and what the country basically did, it had a current account pressure. That is why it went immediately to the IMF in October, and it got that in November. That had to do with the general financial crisis, when banks had to withdraw credit and so on in order to shore up their own balance sheets in the aftermath of the Lehman bankrupt insolvency. And what the problem for Hungary was, as you all know, is that its households are highly indebted. Households and real estate investors, one should say, are highly indebted in euro and Swiss franc. So if the forint had devalued, you would have immediately insolvency in your household sector, in your economy. The country would not be able to pay back this debt. The country, I should say, the individuals. And with it, the banks that are euro area banks largely, Austrian banks and German banks and so on, would immediately have been affected too. And of course, everybody feared that that's why it also got that quick help, is that there would be a spillover into the euro area, generally into the European banking system. That worked rather well. You got a controlled devaluation, the forint went down, and if you look at the data, actually the real devaluation, in other words, taking into account how much the inflation rose, there was a real devaluation. And funnily enough, and it had partly to do with that Germany's market held up better, the current account improved also rather quickly and surprisingly. Quite different in Greece. Greece is about the only country, I would say, Portugal is a bit borderline, that is exactly that nightmare scenario of German Eurosceptics. A country that has for years and years, it has to be said, lived way in fiscal terms, have spent way more than they had in terms of revenue. The Euro study is not such that nobody knew at the time because you were lied. No, you could know. There were reports up on Eurostat, and if you have all these research departments in banks, they could know that, and they could read that up. It was in the Financial Times and so on. But at the time when growth was nice, well, in other words, 4% over pretty much the whole 2000s, nobody cared, and everybody was happy to give credit to Greece. Bonds, the Greek bonds, to the point where the countries, their real overvaluation, i.e. taking into account domestic prices and basically domestic prices with respect to the euro area, was such that it had in 2008 a current account deficit of almost 18%, while Hungary with a current account deficit, I think more of 7%, had to go to the IMF, while Greece didn't. The default that it then could have done with already then, because we found out at the point where they asked for help, they had already a debt ratio of over 100%, and given the growth that immediately imploded, it was clear that the spreads that they then had to pay on their bonds, the extra interest over the benchmark bond, the German bond, that this country would run into a default situation. That was also pretty clear early on, and commentators said so. But it was denied to go into such a default until in March 2012 we had to grant them that. The programs are very different. When you look at the Hungarian program is a classical IMF program. Yes, there is the one attached by the EU as well, but this is the junior partner. The IMF program has these cash-based indicators. Yes, it tells them to do something about taxes and cut spending, cut in particular freeze public wages and get rid of the 13th wage and so on and so forth. Standard things you kind of tell a country in order to get its expenditures down and its revenue up. Full stop. The Greek program has also all these things, but down to saying what the rate structure of its taxes should be, like more progressive. It is clearly not one that says, oh, across the board, just cut, as some of my Greek friends often say, and I have to say, look into the program, they really try to be socially conscientious. I mean, they knew that they would get this charge. They get it anyways, but you know. They try to say, in every case, when they say get rid of the 13th and 14th salary of public servants, but give a lump sum to the low-income public servants, so that that is not so harsh. It's still a cut, but there's a clear element of cutting such that the lower salaries are affected less, same with pensions. And in particular, when you raise taxes, raise them disproportionately, raise the tax rate disproportionately at the upper end. And of course, go after they have lost all sovereignty over tax collection and especially statistical sovereignty they have lost completely. They have basically a team there that does all the paperwork and the statistical work and teaches them now how to raise tax revenue. So the country is semi-sovereign now and has been reined into, down to its social policy, the same, pension reform, down into the detail, accusing them of that it's not only inefficient, as you would expect from the man in grey suits, and it's inefficient, unsustainable, but saying it's inequitable, and that you have to change. So the government looks really bad. Not only that it can't do what a good fiscal authority would do, but it does also not do what a good social policy authority would do, and it is accused of both by the IMF, and in the lead is the EU. And it takes what the EU, what you can see what the EU does, is turning in both, but with less emphasis, and it has only a secondary role in the Hungarian program. It basically takes the surveillance processes outside this Stability and Growth Pact related, which even Hungary has to comply with, except that until recently, no country outside of the EU, but being an EU member, cannot be punished if it fails to comply with these excessive deficit and debt rules and so on. What the EU now does, these surveillance criteria, the fiscal rules in particular, but also long-term sustainability of pensions or age-related spending and so on, they have become focal points after the reform of 2005 that most people say was watering down the SGP. They have become focal points of discussion between high-level civil servants in the treasuries, basically, what country should do, any country, not just Hungary and Greece, but all EU countries. It takes these and turns them into conditionality. In other words, into hard performance criteria that if you do not fulfill them, the money is withdrawn or not paid out. And that is a new quality of how you use that. It didn't matter much, I would think, for the Hungarian program, because there the performance criteria that the IMF imposes are the first call, and in any case, the Fidesz government called off the program, as I said, provoked to be called off before they became binding, while it mattered very much in the case of Greece, given in particular that when you define a criterion like a deficit ratio to GDP, for the reasons I told you earlier, if your economy tanks, and that's outside of the control of the government, then this ratio goes up, so you hold them accountable for something that they basically cannot control. In contrast to a cash-based deficit where you say this much revenue you must raise and this much you must get your expenditure down, that you can control, but not such a ratio because it's an endogenous outcome of how the economy fares under such a harsh adjustment program. We use then, after we've gone through the two packages, we use then this to assess it basically from the point of view of hegemonic stability theory. And this stability theory said, Kindleberger said, a hegemon, in order to provide stability, must basically do three things. It must provide in a liquidity crisis, must play the lender of last resort. He was then discussing very much whether the IMF can do that when the hegemon, the dollar hegemon, is in decline or refuses to play that role anymore. In other words, when you substitute the Federal Reserve Bank with its more or less unlimited power to provide liquidity, you replace that by a finite fund like the IMF that always needs the donors, the major payers, to agree to these sums in advance. It cannot, it needs the guarantees, then it can go to the bond markets and finance it, but it cannot just print the stuff that everybody wants, in contrast to the dollar and the central bank. And it's exactly the situation we are in now, where the Germans block, it's basically the Germans, but the Dutch and the Finns as well, block the ECB to play that role of the lender of last resort in the sense of an infinite fund. So it always says, and so even the ECB now plays this by saying, okay, we have the single market, the securities market program where they bought bonds from the banks. The ECB is not allowed to buy bonds directly from the governments as issuers of bonds. It must always go through the banking system. That was always said, we buy so much, even with this huge long-term refinancing operation that you may have heard, where they, in December last year and February this year, threw basically €1 trillion into the economy. Again, it was said in advance how much that will be. It cannot just say, I print the stuff as the liquidity crisis evolves. But this is basically the role that should be played, that the ECB is that last resort liquidity, and we go through it why even that is limited at the moment, because in the end, when that comes to our second part, a central bank can deal with a liquidity crisis, but after the dust has settled, somebody must say, so which banks have just been illiquid and you tidied them over this time with that unlimited, they had a problem with their cash flow, they had more things to pay out because everybody wants to withdraw money from the banks and it can't call in the obligation to itself, so that's a liquidity crunch. But some of these banks may then be insolvent because, for example, the credit they extended to some firms never comes back because a great recession has wiped out so many firms, and so they have a solvency problem. A solvency problem because the own capital of a central bank is minimal. The ECB has 10.5 billion own capital. It holds today 40 billion or more of Greek bonds. So if you ask the Greeks to pay to, or if the Greeks asked to write down half of it, the own capital of the ECB would be wiped out twice already. That's why the ECB didn't accept that it is part of this hair-cutting exercise. What you then need is a fiscal authority that backs up the central bank, the lender of last resort liquidity. And we don't have that one fiscal authority, as you know. That's why there's all this debate about the Eurobond and so on and so forth, that we should have the, in principle, no, not unlimited, but fairly unlimited capacity of the taxpayer, because it includes the future taxpayers, of course, of backing up the central bank when it has done this bailing out of banks and even sovereign debtors these days. What we have instead is a kind of IMF solution for that. Maybe a finite fund, which for some curious things that we go through in the paper, the Germans insisted in order to reduce the cost of this fund. You know, it works exactly like the IMF. The donor countries give those who sign up to it, give a guarantee to the fund so that the fund, with that guarantee in its back, can go to the bond market and issue its bond with this guarantee. Because the Germans wanted to keep that cost low, they wanted to have a AAA rating for this fund. Which means the rating of this fund is only as good as those who guarantee. And so de facto, only the ones with a AAA rating themselves can guarantee the sum. So the lending capacity, which was said to be 750 billion, includes other issues, but 440 from this fund with the guarantees of the member state, de facto is more like 270. It includes Germany, Austria, Netherlands, and until recently, France. But then in December of last year, 2011, Austria and France were rated down, and one day later the EFSF was rated down. And so it's now no longer it's AA plus or some such nonsense, but it pays now the higher rates. In principle, more countries can now lend or meet this, although quite a few have been rated down. And but it still means it has a limited capacity and actually is very dependent on the markets, very contrary to what a hegemon would do. A hegemon supersedes the markets and says, I'll take you out, I'll pay this so that you're not depending on the market, while this one says, okay, we'll make ourselves dependent on what the markets give us in terms of the rates we pay, in terms of the interest rates we pay, because that depends on your rating. How about the long-term adjustment? To what extent does is in these rescue packages the provision of the public good adjustment that the hegemon can provide? And well, depending on what you think, whether this policy conditionality helps the country to get over it or not, you know, we had the six-packs. We can go through these reforms. I'm actually tired of this, always, you know, always trying to find out what they last time agreed or did not agree and so on. It's a huge package that we now have, and new and reforms ever tighter, ever more extensive. Just to give you that one example, we had the one criterion on which you could be punished, although it was never exercised, the excessive deficit thing of more than 3% of GDP. That is now on the debt criterion of more than 60%. You can also be punished. You can also be punished if you have an excessive imbalance in the current account. In other words, private debt is now controlled too, and you can be punished for it. It can step in much more quickly. It's quasi-automatic. In the second round, the council can only reject this if there's a majority against the recommendation, and there's not much time until the punishment sets in. Renewing a critique that these sanctions always have, namely that in a way they are pro-cyclical and nonsensical. If a country is already in trouble with paying for its expenditure and so on, then to adding to that and say, I punish you and you have now to pay even more, sorry, doesn't make much sense. And even Hungary is now, through the fiscal compact and so on, is now under this. So if you violate these conditions under the excessive deficit procedure, your regional funds may not be paid out. That is actually the threat that hangs over Hungary at the moment. So the adjustment is all about, we want to push you into good governance, but we don't give you much for it. It's all just good advice with a lot of threat behind it, and I'm not sure that can work in a community of sovereign member states. But we can discuss this. My Greek colleagues, of course, say, no, this is the only way of how we can change. So within these countries, you hear sometimes different things. I come to the conclusion. Something we haven't said so clearly in our paper, but this is what we think, is the EU tries in a way, and that's a great title of a paper, the European Rescue of the Washington Consensus by Susanne Litz and Matthias Franke from Berlin Free University. In other words, they're saying they do try to use this preference imposing conditionality, but without the hegemony and its resources behind it. so become ever more detailed, and the EU goes even further than the Washington Consensus, to be fair to the Washington Consensus. But we think, like the original, it's neither effective nor legitimate, neither effective, both programs failed in a way, nor legitimate, and that is a really critical issue for the EU. If you say, even with the best intentions, you say, you know, you must not only have a sustainable pension system, but also an equitable. While I'm all in favor of telling governments that they also have to think about some social policy concerns, and the Greeks were really bad in privileging just parts of their population, while the farmers, you know, people who had not this attachment to their young people, are really disadvantaged by the whole regime. On the other hand, you undermine the government even more if you don't only tell them, you don't do what's right economically, you don't even do the right things that social policy-wise. And that undermines the government completely. The other two conclusions we have is, unfortunately, we cannot just go back to Greece, to Greece and say, nah, we should not do with you what Hungary has done. For the one simple reason, we cannot do a controlled devaluation. I mean, some think now Greece should go up, and then it has this wonderful opportunity of controlled devaluation. We are not very convinced by that. Hungary's solution is itself very fragile, and when the markets take against you, then actually it's worse if you have your own currency. Think about what would happen if the forint tanks by 50%. Well, then your household savings, wealth of your household sector is wiped out because you revalue that debt that you have. That cannot happen to Greece inside. That's why the problem was allowed to accumulate much more. The adjustment was so to speak postponed, but it also rules out nominal depreciation, even though the problem is now much bigger than it was for Hungary when it sought the assistance. This is the difficulty we have. You also understand, I mean, I'm very critical, and it's on record, of the German position in all this, but on the other hand, and I say this for all EU members, because the Germans always do this as if only they pay for this. Well, everybody else pays for it, and frankly, it's a huge subsidy for the German export industry as well, what we just pay at the moment to Greece, and banks and so on. But it is true, it is a bit more difficult to let Greece basically do the default as an equivalent of devaluation in the case of Hungary. Because there is an externality to the common currency that you showed. It is a common good. And yes, you lose that sovereignty over you with decisions that have macroeconomic implications for the currency, and so letting them easily off the hook is not an option. And just nobody knows how to do it in a fair and acceptable way for everybody. Coming to the EU, and I'm afraid for you, the last lecture, we do not have much. We don't end on a high note. But there's also no IMF solution. The interesting thing that we just became clear by through rewriting this paper is that the IMF solution itself is too limited. But even the IMF solution today would be one where the EU can walk away and so on. The problem for the EU is it cannot walk away. You know, it could withdraw, and once the IMF has gone through this learning process that the Washington Consensus does not normally work. There may have been countries like the transition countries that were extraordinarily receptive for the advice, because they quickly wanted to become reunite with Europe and change and so on. This is normally not the case, and so we have abandoned the Washington Consensus because just nobody seems to have realized it. But even if the EU then would adopt this and take this lesson from the IMF, it is a fund that has limited resources for debt crisis and liquidity crisis. The EU cannot walk away because this is, and it has this problem even with Hungary, because it is a community that has many bonds. And in the absence of this hegemonic paymass that we think is not forthcoming, And it's also, in a sense, it would not only be enough with Germany alone. Germany is, in that sense, too small for doing it all. It would, given that we have made ourselves so dependent on ratings, and so it would be rated down as well if we would take on all these debts. So in the absence of that paymaster, the only thing that we see is the adaptation to the post-hegemonic reality is that financial integration must be qualified and must be moderated. That taboo, that more integration is always better integration, that must be questioned. Otherwise, we do not see how the EU can survive. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we're now getting questions from the audience. So you open the.
Thank you very much for your talk. You have two visitors from Australia here who find it very interesting. We're travelling through.
Where do you come from?
Australia.
I have heard that, but where from?
Victor Harbour, south of Adelaide in South Australia.
Okay,
Victor
so
Harbour.
from the university there, or? So what's your affiliation?
We have no affiliation. We saw an advertisement for the lecture and it sounded very
Good.
interesting. Particularly since we've just spent a few weeks in Greece.
Oh, I see. Good.
And Hungary.
Good.
But we are teachers.
And I'm part of the German heritage, so we fight off.
Very good. Thank you.
Anyhow, just one small question.
Yeah.
I agree with 99% of what you said. There's one thing, just in your conclusion, where you claimed without evidence that the EU can't walk away from either Hungary and or Greece.
Yeah. No evidence for that. Deborah, do you want to respond to this?
Sure. To give you a little break. I mean, the reason why we say that is just that we see the EU as being engaged in a bigger political project. And to take the case of Hungary, which is the one where you think they could perhaps walk away, the reason not to is that would be an admission of failure of something that the EU has tried to do now ever since the end of the Cold War, which is to bring these Central European countries into the greater European project. And so to just say, okay, this government is beyond the pale and doesn't comply with European norms, so we sort of forget about it, we won't pay it any more structural funds or cohesion funds, and we cut it loose, amounts to an admission of defeat of everything that the EU has tried to do in the last 20 years.
And Deborah gives you the argument in substance, I give you the legal argument. There is no way, you believe it or not, to get out, and that is true only for Greece. There is no way of, they have never thought about what is if somebody wants to leave the monetary union. There is no regular way of doing this. There is now, only since this recent treaty in Lisbon, how you can leave the EU. But I am pretty sure none of these countries wants to leave the EU, because what basically happens, this is your big market to which you want to have access under the WTO rules and so on. I mean, you become a pariah state that pays such high interest rates and so on. But then, if that is the case, it's also very hard to throw them out. And as Deborah rightly says, the whole project is built on ever more European Union. We expect the next member, and that's Croatia. We have now, formally agreed on that. Croatia will be next. It is a political project, and even in its legal sense, almost just to be a one-way street.
Yes, we've
But
just
it's
come
a
from
fair
Croatia.
question.
They're pretty keen on joining too.
Say it again.
We've just spent 10 days in Croatia after we left Greece, and they're certainly a very hard-working country, but perhaps there's not the debt problems that many of the current members have.
And let me put it that
I
way.
still
I mean,
don't
if
agree
you
with
look,
you. Can I just follow up my thesis? Because you reversed it into saying, no, the members don't want to leave the EU. Agreed. And 67% of Greeks have indicated by the latest poll they want to remain members, despite any election votes. And I agree with that sentiment. But apart from the bad look and the politically bad timing with respect to Croatia, I don't see why the EU couldn't cut them less. given that their irresponsible spending, paying pensions to dead people for decades, etc.?
Because it's basically very difficult to get rid of a country. I mean, you have to have glaring violations of rules before a procedure can even be started. And out of the EU, everybody says now, if Greece defaults and if that government there calls off the program, then that's the end of Greece in Europe. I will be actually curious what's going to happen. Because it looks as if the government in Greece calls off the program. They cannot throw them out, as far as I know. This is what journalists write, and I don't know on which basis. If anybody knows, then I would be interested to hear that. Perhaps because of a view on this as well.
Maybe we discuss it, but maybe we can take up questions.
Sure.
Can I just follow up with one last statement? It's not my personal view that they should be cut loose.
No.
In fact, if Germany paid perhaps what their debts should be morally, if not financially, from World War II reparations, then in fact Greece may be credited not to.
I think there was somebody. Yeah.
Doro and then
Thanks a lot for the talk. It's really interesting. And I like this. I do like your comparison between Hungary and Greece, and I have a problem with it. So here's my question. You start with a puzzle. Why is the one, why we have to fast rescue of Hungary and we don't have a reaction to the Greek story. But then, and you start saying these are very similar cases, but then already the second slide tells you these are very different cases.
Yeah.
Right? The crisis is a different one, the magnitude is a different one, the leading actor is a different one, and of course Hungary is not part of the Eurozone. So my hunch would be your puzzle is explained by this, and not. But then I tried to find, so how do you explain it? And then I didn't really find it, because you seem at the end of the day to say that what we really have in Europe is a post-hegemonic constellation, and both cases reflect it. But not the speed, right? Just both cases reflect somehow that there is a post-hegemonic constellation. So I couldn't then really find the answer to your puzzles, or maybe you could explain this better to me. But then I was wondering, this is then the second question. Wasn't Europe always in a post-hegemonic constellation? I mean, Germany was never a hegemon at all, similar to the US and so on. So it could, of course, survive in a nicer way until we had US hegemony covering it all up, and basically the European Monetary Union is an attempt to form something new in a post-hegemonic, global post-hegemonic constellation, if you want. But then I wonder whether it really helps you all that much bringing Hindenburg into the European Union. Because then you end up saying, yeah, well, there is no hegemon in Europe, but that was always the case. So maybe can you also react to this to sharpen your argument there? And then the last thing, if you don't...
Very good comment has 3 parts there.
Because you say Hungary was a failure and Greece was a failure. Now Hungary was, if you want, not a failure of the program necessarily, but the government that has very different priorities right now. So if you want success, why don't you take Latvia? Very similar story as the Hungarian. Did the austerity all the way through. Nobody protests, nobody changes governments, nobody does nothing there at all. They didn't come back through. I mean, they basically comply with everything. So it might be more interesting contrast if you want to tease out something about the programs themselves.
Shall I?
Yes, you can make a start.
You can think of the answer to question 1, which I think is the hardest one.
Oh, okay.
I mean, just to take the last point, to be honest, when we wrote the paper, we did have a Hungarian success, if you like, and a Greek failure. But we obviously had to adjust the argument in the light of the fact that Hungary then managed to move itself into the failure zone. I mean, as you say, not really for economic reasons, but for political reasons. So, yeah, I mean, from that point of view, it's not an ideal case any longer, but I mean, in some ways, still a very interesting one. I think also for what it shows about the EU's position. And to come to that, your second question, hasn't Europe always been post-hegemonic? Well, I think the gist of our argument is that, yes, substantively that's the case. There is no hegemonic stability provider in Europe. What we see as being the issue and the problem is that the European Council and the Commission have behaved as if they could be hegemonic providers of stability. And we see that particularly in the way that they seized the opportunity to take all these soft conditions from the Stability and Growth Pact and so on and turn them into loan conditions. Actually, I mean, they took soft conditions not only from the Stability and Growth Pact, but also from, you know, bits of the Lisbon agenda and so on. I mean, it's amazing what they cut and pasted into these loan agreements about things to do with labour market reform and things like that. You think, what is this doing in this loan agreement? You know, this is just more EU policy where over the years they've been very frustrated that elites in these countries have not taken up these policy agendas, and now they think, oh, this is our big chance. We put it in a loan agreement, they really have to comply. And that was always, I think, just a very mistaken idea, basically because, you know, to put it very bluntly, these forms of conditionality have no track record of working at all. And in a sense, I mean, this is, I can see that this is something that's not, we haven't quite resolved yet, a sort of tension in the paper, that when we describe the hegemonic era and conditionality in that era, we're actually describing forms of conditionality that are very discretionary and, to be honest, you know, quite lax. I mean, you can document in the 1960s all sorts of country cases where the US basically allowed Brazil and other major debtor countries to borrow rather freely from the IMF and didn't push it much at all for compliance with even the most standard basic set of conditions. So we see this conditionality behavior of the EU as being a sort of mistake about what conditionality can do, and also a mistake about what it can uphold in terms of providing stability. I guess that's, but you know, substantively, I think we agree with you that it cannot be a hegemonic provider of stability.
And I take up the first question with a little comment on the third with Latvia. Why not Latvia? We did start out with a similarity that we thought is then really puzzling why the programs went so different. And even with the failure, they went so differently. The failure was so different for the reasons you mentioned. Latvia was not known to be a delinquent country, which tests, so to speak, the patience of the community with these two countries. Hungary was told off over and over and really gave a few harsh council conclusions for its fiscal performance. And the same with Greece. If we then say they are different, however, look at our second slide, they are different in a way that you would almost say, so they should have, if anything, helped Greece more quickly. Because it has this externality, if that country fails and defaults, and has no way out with devaluation and so on, it has a huge externality on everybody. So in the self-interest of every monetary union member, you would have expected they go on much more quickly and more effectively on Greece, and the opposite happened. So to us, the difference is almost the difference that shifts a bit the weight towards Greece should have been helped more quickly than Hungary. When we then don't find it, we have our puzzle, and then how we explain that is to say, in a way, in the simplest way, and you're quite right to say that we haven't fully answered that, if you somehow lose a bit your original thing because other things are interesting. It is because in the Hungarian program, it was the IMF that was in the senior position. The EU tried to do there the same thing, although it's much shorter. While in Greece, it finally says we need to transform this country from the bottom up. And we tell them what to do. We don't let them just ask for certain outcomes. We ask now, well, which policy action they have to take in order to achieve this. Much more detail, down to social policy in the Greek case, and that has to do with the EU being in the senior position.
Actually, Deborah asked my questions as well, but I want to come back to your reply because I'm not 100% convinced by the argument in the sense that what's going on probably with Greece is that, okay, probably the international investors thought this is kind of a safe bet so we can go much further with our speculation. And then I think your argument shoots the other way around because you create even more uncertainty and even much more of predicament of both sides. Because in the Hungarian case, basically the European Union really can come with, you do whatever you want in the sense that there's not a currency to be defended. But in the Greek case, you open Pandora's box perhaps, right? And if the financial market knows this, it tries its luck even much more than in the Hungarian case. So there might still be an asymmetry between countries within the currency union and country outside the currency union. That was my remark. But actually I have two other questions which Deborah already asked them. One is just to tease you a little bit. Why is it so bad that, unlike the IMF, the European Commission also wants to put some kind of progressive frame to it? I mean, if you think about it, this was what the IMF really got into this reputation was this kind of brutality, alleged. Apparently conditionality is not always working, but at least in terms of policy discourse, the IMF kind of conditionality SAP programs become fully discredited at some point, at least very difficult to sustain. So isn't that kind of some interesting thought? And the other thing is just this financial integration, kind of rolling it back. But as much as I sympathize about it, I'm not really sure how to do this on a practical level, and would not be the solution be more regulation than rolling back financial integration? So I mean really like a common European financial regulation that takes care of that there is not in the first place a housing bubble in Spain or wherever, than trying to now impose all these kind of barriers that can then again be avoided, because it's about arbitrage, and you create more arbitrage if you go back, right?
We start with the financial integration. I guess the chain of thought there was, we take a bit of a simplification. We could say the sensible route out for Hungary was to allow this controlled devaluation. The equivalent for Greece would have been to default at a much earlier stage, and a lot of what we see going on is about postponement of default. Then our thought was, well, if we take that seriously, we say there should have been a default much earlier. That sort of amounts to saying that the level of financial integration in Europe should go backwards. Because you quite rightly pointed out that the key feature of the currency union was that it created this idea of risk-free investment in these peripheral areas. And as soon as you would get a major default, you can expect that flow of funds is going to really dry up a lot. And far from seeing themselves as trading risklessly in a common currency, all the major financial institutions would start to assess their portfolios. I mean, I'm sure they're starting to do this now already, but they would assess their portfolios in the southern countries or the peripheral countries very differently to the portfolios in the core northern countries. So, I mean, de facto, we already have a reduction in financial integration occurring, and it would amount to saying, well, we actually accept that and we live with that and we build that into regulatory frameworks, that's what's going to happen. So I guess that was where that particular argument came from, that you have to learn to live with less financial integration than seemed to be aspired to in the heyday, in the sort of heady days after first establishing the currency union.
And of course the common financial regulation, macroprudential, so to say, a country in which there is a bubble has to have higher reserve requirements on its banks, and that may even have to be imposed of these banks in another member state, is a form of disintegration. You differentiate much more and add to the one size has to fit all interest rate policy and make differences. As much as I would like to leave it at that, I'm afraid this is not enough, because the Spaniards have actually tried it. They did introduce macroprudential regulation before everybody now got on this latest thing, which is a very good development. And the problem is when there is this you know, easy optimism, it is very hard for a regulator to break a housing bubble when the middle classes all feel, and young people, they cannot get on the housing ladder and so on. So I'm afraid you need other robust instruments and actually a bit less integration that feeds into these bubbles more and more, and it's almost impossible to break. The other thing, I'm not against them taking, on the contrary, when I talk to my Greek friends that say, it's all across the board, I always say, no, it isn't. They have really made an attempt to say you must have progressive tax rises and be careful what you do with the low salaries. They didn't want to have this criticism. But you have to see the side effect of it, that you undermine what you do inevitably with the conditionality program. We just, actually you read the paper, but a friend of ours has done a paper on protest in countries that undergo programs, and they seem to find that you will have more protests in countries where you have an IMF program, because it makes your government look weak and these foreigners now rule the roost. What is this in a democracy? When you then go so deep that you say not only do you not have a economically justifiable policy, but even socially it is a bad policy that your government has done. I mean, it undermines them all. And perhaps it has to be said, but still.
Yeah, I think you can see this. I mean, it's true that the Washington consensus itself sort of gravitated to, you know, putting on this nice poverty programs and so on, and that all looked like something that made the Bretton Woods institutions seem much cuddlier than they had done. But I think there is a sort of counter-argument that says there used to be a division of labor, as it were. You know, the IMF would tell you the envelope, and then it was still up to the government to decide what it did within that envelope. And now you might think, well, it certainly sometimes made the IMF look bad, but I think Waltraud's right. It was a way that preserved at least some bit of sovereignty for the country subject to the program. So I also am not so sure that. I mean, I also put my social policy hat on. I would say that actually these social policy designs that they bring in, much as we think that things in Greece are inequitable and so on, I think generally there are some problems with the social policy designs they bring in. You know, they tend to be very targeted, not very alert to administrative issues about all that targeting, not at all concerned about how you build political constituencies for social policy. So they're also just a bit detached from the reality of how any country ever maintains a social policy. In that sense, I don't think they're particularly valuable either, I'm afraid, even though, yeah, it makes the letter look a lot better.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this talk. I'm still sort of struggling also a little bit with this comparison still. I still can't really sort of think about it, that there's not a problem of apples and oranges here in terms of the Hungary and Greece. And also I'm struggling with this the theoretical approach with this the hegemonic stability and how that actually helps you to get a better insight into both of these countries. And one way of that I was trying to make sense of this, that as a heuristic device, or whether that is what you're actually trying to get at, is that so to speak, the IMF bailouts with Hungary or other countries are in a way sufficient, or they produce occasional sort of slight favors, but not, you know, that problematic. Mm-hmm. They are in a way sufficient or possible ways to cope with this post-hegemonic situation, given the different frameworks, the different contexts within which this kind of program operates. While I'm just kind of insinuating, what happens at the EMU level would in a way require a much stronger, in a way closer to the original paymaster situation type of hegemony in order to cope actually with the problems that EMU is confronted with. That was kind of my way of sort of making, and I was just wondering whether that is something you would subscribe to, because in the conclusions you seem then to say, oh, well actually it seems more like financial integration might need to be scaled back. But the slide before, you were actually more kind of suggesting in a way, okay, the EC, the European Central Bank does this and that, but it could do more. The stability mechanism does this and that, but you know, the discussions are about Eurobonds and so on. So I was just wondering to push you a bit further and go to this, and whether this is in a way what you are actually trying to argue. Should, so to speak, the European monetary union come closer to a kind of a paymaster? And that brings me then to the next one. The final question is, so in what ways is then this kind of argument about hegemonic stability and the sort of paymaster different from the kind of classic economist notion of the optimum currency area and the kind of restrictions that you would have, and the kind of the institutional preconditions that you need to have in place in order to have a successful currency?
Mentioning optimal currency areas is a bit of a red rag to Waltraud. I think actually some people in the room already know that. Which question to start with? I mean, I think in a way I found your way of making sense of it quite appealing. Should the EU be trying to move closer to being a paymaster? I guess what we were doing in that part of the paper, which has evolved through time because events keep moving on, is sort of working out how all the things that really stop it from evolving to that position. So, a few years ago we wrote along with other people about how a Eurobond was needed, and without that you really couldn't begin to stabilize the situation. But I mean, I don't know if Waltraud agrees with this, but personally I think we've sort of gone a bit post-Eurobond now. In a way, and you can see just how difficult it is for the EU to be the paymaster. So, in that sense, I suppose I have gravitated a bit towards your summary of it. I mean, if I may answer the last question slightly indirectly, I was thinking, as Waltraud was going through the presentation, whether there would be a much sort of more straightforward way of setting up the comparisons, which I don't think there is, incidentally, but I know it was running through my mind, could we just take this as being, what really are the problems of being inside a monetary union compared with being outside? Because that's the obvious difference between these two countries. And I think what we're saying is it's not just as simple as one can devalue and the other can't. And in that sense, it's not about optimal currency area. I think what we're trying to do, and I'm not sure we've quite succeeded, is to show how much else is going on in terms of, particularly of debt and how debt is managed and so on. That it's much less a problem about trade flow adjustment, which is what the OCA tends to emphasize, and much more a problem of these stocks of financial assets, nature of financial integration, different ways. I mean, a devaluation and a default are in many ways this in debt terms, they're the same thing in a way. A devaluation is a way of writing off some of your debt if it's denominated in foreigns. And of course, there was this problem that a lot of it is not denominated in foreigns. But if it is, then you're giving everyone a haircut, and that's like a controlled default. But we can see that a devaluation is in practice completely different to a default. So why is that? And that is a bit what we're trying to sort of trace through and work out. So I would say that's the key difference with the OCA.
I'm not so sure that we are post-Eurobond. I think the next step is that we will introduce one without calling it that, because Angela Merkel has excluded that, and a lot of people have excluded that, although a lot may change when we have a red-green government in Berlin. But they will introduce it with this growth initiative that they now must give the French in order to have a face-saving device for Hollande to get this fiscal compact through, which in my view doesn't do anything to solve this crisis. But they will have then the EIB issue Euro bonds. I mean, that's what it is, and do nice things with it, like growth financing and so on. And from there, you know, it goes in small steps, and so I do think that the Eurobonds will come, but not unlimited. For that, there is a good democratic reason. I mean, you then have to give the European Parliament really a different role. If you say, for up to 60% say, we have joint and several liability, well, then there must be a European parliamentary approval for this. And I don't see that anybody wants this, and frankly, when I look at this European Parliament, I myself would not be terribly enthusiastic about that. So far, I don't see that the national parties and so on send their best people to Brussels and Strasbourg, to put it mildly. In what way different from OCA theory? I mean, don't get me going, but the one thing is the OCA theory always said we have to be as similar as possible in order to that we build this club. And my view of it is, no, if you think of this as an insurance arrangement, where we basically pool our risks and help each other, and the Eurobond would be an important institution to so to speak, realize that potential of insurance. But the currency, common currency itself, is an insurance mechanism, namely against current account crises. We benefit from differences. In any insurance, I don't want to go with every people that have the same risk profile as us, as myself. Then I can't insure myself. I want to have a diversified portfolio, and that's the idea. And you must accept that we have sovereign member states. You cannot pretend as if they are all, depending on one federal budget and all that stuff, which we don't have. So build your institutions around that fact. But then I think we can actually have an advantage from that. Our business cycles are not all synchronized, because then you have huge fluctuations and still regions that don't quite fit into this bit, but a more moderate one. And your ECB doesn't have to do with this one interest rate and perhaps now liquidity and reserve requirements so much in a very heterogeneous union. So that is my idea why I think this OCA theory, apart from the fact that no country in the world is an optimum currency area, so why should the euro area be one? I hate this whole idea of we have to be all the same. Why should we? It is unity and diversity in that sense, economically formed.
I'll have a second bite of the cherry. It's a different topic. It's a very interesting discussion. Thanks for the questions and responses. Deborah, you mentioned revenue. I think that's part of the issue here that needs to be looked at. If you've got sufficient revenue to cover your expenses, there's no problem. Because, common households know that, country treasurers know that. Except perhaps in the case of Greece, where there's very sloppy administration for a period of time, or careless administration. But even that's not going to the heart of the problem. The problem is bigger than the EU. And part of the problem with revenue is not getting sufficient revenue from the top end, either the population or from company taxation. Companies these days, the most powerful companies, don't belong to a nation. They have no sovereignty, no sovereign loyalty or restrictions. Particularly in the southern hemisphere, we find this is a very big factor economically. We're finding it now in Europe, with the division between North and Southern Europe split. Companies will move at will as it suits their balance sheets and their logistics and their forecasts of costs and revenue. In other words, their profit margins. There is no global regulation. In fact, there's insufficient national regulation of the banking system. Money's moved around at will. The English are still very skilled at doing this, manipulating it to retain their wealth. It's built on slavery from centuries past. They now use, despite inefficient industrial part of the economy, inefficient agriculture, they still maintain a high standard of living and much wealth by manipulating the money markets. Well, what I'm suggesting is that we need perhaps to be looking beyond the EU. The single biggest player in the world today, in fact, is China. They hold massive amounts and they're buying more of gold. They hold massive amounts of euros and American dollars.
Can I
Perhaps
just
you-
interrupt because this China bashing.
I'm not bashing
Oh,
China.
no. It
They had
is
an
a
empire
tendency
lasted
when we
for a
go
long
into the crisis that are now in the First World, and the whole since 2007 has started there. And the imbalances in the world economy didn't help, but they were in no way involved in this. And China is doing the biggest poverty relief program that the world has ever seen. I'm totally against the Europeans or the US for that matter to then go with their things into China, because this is a problem that the First World has created with its deregulation of financial markets in that sense. And I'm not somebody who says financial markets, they are the enemy of the real economy. No, capitalism has financial markets and it will always have. This is capitalism. But the way it was deregulated, that created the problem. And this, the markets will know best. That clearly had to go. And China has actually made the best out of this deregulated world and arguably more institutional barriers to protectionism. And that's good. That's the good side of what we have seen in the last 30 years. The bad side we see in the First World War, World War is always close for German. But we see the bad side we see now in the OECD world and what has have done through these financial markets. And if anything, I would think, that the Europeans in particular, what they do at the moment with the IMF is already stretching a bit what these BRIC countries and so on should contribute. As some high senior IMF official has said, the problem we have with getting ever more programs for Greece and so on through is there are countries who pay up for you now that have lower minimum wages than Greece and more poverty. And they are asked to put in ever more resources in the IMF because the Europeans cannot get their act together. And so instead of looking to China, I think the Europeans must look at themselves, whether they want this thing or not. And it's their problem. And the corporate taxes, yes, it is a bit of an issue, but again, I would think a minor one compared to what needs to be built in institutions at the moment. You may have heard that the EU leans, or the Germans and the French lean on Ireland and wanted to almost make a conditionality that they have to raise their corporate taxes. I think they should lean a bit on the Irish. On the other hand, I would be against them leaning on the Central and Eastern Europeans. If you have certain disadvantages in your infrastructure, you must have some advantage for your firms to come and build up an economy. So one should be, also there is no simple recipe there, in my view.
If I could come back on the first part of what you were saying as well, I mean, I think I would reinforce what Waltraud has said, that sure, Europe can't do everything, but it's quite striking how much, within Europe, some of these problems about evading top-level tax and corporate tax could be addressed. So, if you think in the UK recently, there's been a discussion about Amazon not paying sales tax on a lot of things because it supposedly sends them from Luxembourg. So it doesn't pay UK VAT, and Luxembourg has a very low rating for VAT on DVDs or something like that. Well, that's clearly an intra-European problem. You might think, okay, crack down on Luxembourg, they'll go off somewhere else. But actually, it's quite striking how these mobile agents do run out of other places to go. Especially other places that they really want to live in, that provide them with all the environmental public goods that they've become used to. So I think Europe could itself address these problems. And in a way, actually, the crisis, it had one good effect quite early on, which is that it helped to trigger this crackdown on Swiss bank accounts. If there hadn't been the background of all these countries desperate to improve their tax revenue, I think it would have been harder to get the Swiss to do all that disclosure. So, what I would like to see as somebody holding a British passport is that Britain really takes possession of Guernsey and Jersey and Bermuda and Bahamas and all these these protectorates that are allowed to operate these very damaging policies. But those are actually within the political ambit of the European countries. So they can't solve every problem, but they can solve quite a few of these problems with the political will. So maybe that's a more optimistic ending. On a high note.
Any more questions?
Oh, thanks, Dick. Hi, I'm Brian. I'm a student of political science here. And I have a question that is, I'm sorry, not really related to this hegemony, but perhaps something we've discussed. You mentioned that in the process of bailout for Greece, basically the surveillance mechanisms were transformed into conditionality mechanisms. And I sense a bit of skepticism whether this sort of conditionality is a really good thing for Greece. I'm just wondering, what do you think? Whether you think that these changes to European governance, like fiscal compact, the European semester, the six-pack, are sort of like an opportunity or a threat for countries like my own Slovakia, that are in the Eurozone and that will be sort of influenced by these, even though we are probably not in the need of immediate sort of financial assistance. Thank you.
Whether that conditionality and so on that they introduce now could also be a threat to a country like Slovakia.
No, that's threat, but sort of, because we are now basically subjected to this EU kind of punishment mechanism, right? Not only the deficit, but also the debt level, sort of, and also the imbalance, account imbalances.
Yeah.
And so whether this will kind of help us to prevent, having a irresponsible fiscal policy in the future, or whether this is a sort of threat that we will have to now comply with some conditions that might not be really sort of good for our economy.
I mean, where in the scoreboard you're already under surveillance, and the new scoreboard for the macroeconomic imbalances procedure, at the end of which you can, although not as quickly as under the fiscal rules, you can be fined. There's an interesting grey shade over Slovakia. Slovakia is almost on every fiscal and so on is fine. It has, however, a current account imbalance of minus 4.1%. And the threshold level has been determined as 4%, so you are shaded. While the surplus, the current account surplus threshold is plus 6%, and it so happens that Germany has 5.9%. So it's not shaded. It has a few other things like, there's private debt in it, there is the current account imbalance, as I just said, the wage increases relative to others and so on. And what strikes you when you look at the 2012 scoreboard, where there are these, I think, 8 criteria, is that no country is not shaded. And there is not a concentration on some countries all shaded, and the others white. This is the other thing. It will be extremely difficult to say which country has now a real problem. There are countries that have a public debt and a private debt problem. So according to national accounting, how you then can adjust, the only thing is exports. And there are 2 countries, Austria and the Netherlands, just to give you this example. They have a public debt and a private debt problem according to the criteria, but they also have a very high current account surplus. So if you then say, how could they deleverage public and private debt? They would have to have more of an export surplus still. So they would get into an excess there. What I'm saying with this, it is right that they look at these criteria, but they are very different stories and constellations. It's not easy to read off from them what you should do. And frankly, with private debt, it's actually, if we would know what to do, the Spaniards would have done it long ago because their central bank actually was aware of the problem. So to tie to that then a punishment is in my view ridiculous. And all what will happen is they will not punish any country. And then the reporting is, they just watered down, we let everybody off the hook, it's all moral hazard. It's nonsense. It's not possible to do that. You have to take it as a focal point for discussion and policy coordination. That's what needs to be done. In Germany, whether 5.9 or 6.1 has to reduce its export surplus to help other countries to adjust and stimulate its own economy. And yes, perhaps Slovakia has to watch its current country. But this is the way of how you should deal with each other in a union of sovereign nation state, and not think there can be somebody who punishes you for difficult policy problems to monitor.
Any more questions? So we're up to time, so thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you.